Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green and sustainable planet, us and all other beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, an athlete and fellow plant eater who strives to optimize every living ecosystem. Passionate about looking after this beautiful floating rock we call home and all the lovely creatures that dwell among it. Before we get into today's incredible episode, I want to touch on something. If you are not part of the Plant Paradigm newsletter, get your butt to theplantparadigm.com and get onto it. This is a monthly email that has an update on conversations of the month, latest science in the environmental world, and whatever we've been up to. Whether it's a new recipe, workout regime, or documentary, it's your place to get the latest. While we're nowhere near a news-based email, we'll always have a tip on how we can better ourselves and the planet. With that out of the way, I think we should touch on today's guest, the amazing Emma Hurst. We are going to be talking a lot through the lens of politics today. Emma is the Deputy Chair of the Legislative Council's Industry. She's a vegan and a representative for animal rights in the New South Wales Parliament. Politics and legislation is not something we talk about a lot on the show, which is why I was very excited to host this conversation. We'll touch on Parliament a fair bit, the role of lobbyists, animal agriculture and the battling their regimes, and how we can make a difference as individuals. Of course, that is the important question. We don't want to feel powerless in a democratic society, so making a difference is important for our fulfillment and for our happiness. I'm sure you'll find this episode quite informative and interesting. And with that being said, I will see you all on the other side. Emma, welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast. How are you going?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing very, very well, thank you. We've got you coming off C19, feeling good, feeling great, ready to tackle the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm nearly 100%, but I also was one of those people who were luckily enough fairly asymptomatic. So very lucky there. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really big year for animals again. Obviously, despite whatever is happening over the last 2 years, we've been working so hard for animals, despite everything that's been thrown at us. And so I expect that this year we'll be doing exactly the same.
So what is coming up for the Year of Animals?
So this year, a really big thing will be puppy farming. I put up legislation to outlaw puppy farming. I have struggled to get the government to agree to outlaw the intensive factory farming of dogs for the pet trade industry. So we put up our own legislation, but they've actually moved that now to an inquiry. So that'll be a 6-month parliamentary inquiry in the upper house. We're also pushing for a change around the use of animals in experimentation. So I've actually been speaking with industry insiders who have exposed a lot to me. And so we really need to push for an inquiry there. But we're also reviewing the entire Protection Against Cruelty to Animals Act. So these are the laws that actually protect animals. So everything's in there. So from tethering animals to putting hens in battery cages, these are the laws that allow things to happen or outlaw certain things. So that's another inquiry, and that's going to be a big one because obviously, we want to get some changes there, but we've got such a conservative government that it's going to be very difficult, but it'll be a huge year for animals.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's so much I can dive into there. The first thing that actually really shocked me is the industrialization of puppy farming. On this show, we generally talk a bit more about the climate science, fitness, nutrition, and not too much about the ethics. And so when I'm talking around, obviously we've talked about adopting and not shopping a lot of times because it is actually atrocious. Like looking at RACV, there's tens of thousands of cats and dogs and other animals that actually get euthanized every year because they can't get adopted. They don't have the facilities or the funding available to keep that. So obviously, blanket rule, adopt, don't shop. But what exactly do you mean with industrialized puppy farming?
So in New South Wales, there's no limit on the number of female dogs that any one person can have. and absolutely no limit on the number of litters that she can be forced to endure. So you could have 1,000 dogs living in kennels for their entire lives and being forced to pump out litter after litter for their entire lives. That is puppy farming, and it's perfectly legal in New South Wales. It was outlawed in Victoria. Their legislation effectively outlawed it. So they've put a cap on the number of female breeders to 10, and also they've capped the number of litters that any female dog can have. But what we've seen in New South Wales is a lot of the puppy farmers in Victoria have simply moved across the border into New South Wales, where our laws are failing these companion animals. And so it's becoming the puppy farming hub of Australia. We're talking to councils literally on the border. One of them recently had an application for a farm with 600 female dogs. Now, you've got to remember as well, this is for the female dogs. On top of that, you've got the male dogs that the animals will breed with. Plus, if you've got 400 of them at any one time with litters of puppies, there's not even any staffing ratios for these places in New South Wales. So some of these places, they might just have 1 or 2 people living on the property that is supposedly meant to provide the care for all of those animals. That's why I say it's industrialised, and that's why I say it's an industry, because we're literally pumping out puppies from these facilities. And I think a lot of people who are looking to bring a companion animal into their home don't realise that that's actually what's happening behind the scenes, and that most animals that are being sold through pet shops and online are actually coming from these sorts of facilities.
So I'm not big in the world of pets or companion animals, which is probably the more PC term. I'm not understanding how there's a trade for this, because pet shops, I haven't seen one in many, many years anywhere. So where are people going? Or is there a way that we can stop this or regulate this? Or is there a black market situation going on?
So a lot of these animals are being sold online. And of course, online sales and pet shops end up being smoke screens for these exact types of facilities. And the problem is a lot of people go online, they see these beautiful images of these puppies living in these idyllic situations, and they go and meet this person at a meeting place, or the animal gets delivered to their home. And so they never actually realise that those animals are coming from puppy farms. We get a lot of calls from people that suddenly have this very sick puppy, and then they do their research and they realise that maybe they've accidentally bought from one of these puppy farms. But because it's not illegal, even organisations like the RSPCA that would investigate these places when complaints come through, they're very limited on what they can actually do to shut them down, because puppy farming is still legal. So look, our big thing obviously is adopt, don't shop. There are so many loving companion animals at rescue centres, and there's also pet shops now that actually just adopt animals from rescue centres as well. And so that's proven to be a really successful business model, to actually work as an adoption centre, and then to obviously make their profit from selling the items that animal will need. They'll need a bed, they'll need food, they might need a litter tray. There is a shift sort of within that pet shop sort of industry, but there's still massive numbers of animals that are being sold online as well. And so, our legislation really works towards a licensing scheme, so that anybody who sells an animal online can be tracked, and they can be traced down and they can be inspected. And we also require them to be inspected every single year and registered with council to be able to, have this breeder licensing number. There has to be some kind of a regulation around the breeding of animals, so that we don't have those kind of conditions where you've got 600 dogs being forced to pump out litters.
Yeah, it very much rings kind of that same level of that happy cow greenwashing with the dairy farms and stuff like that, where these puppies are, like you said, put in idyllic situations. Is this an issue for cats as well, or mainly dogs?
There is an issue with cats as well. There is certainly kitten farming, and our legislation actually covers both. It's less spoken about, kitten farming, because it's less popular, and it's not as big of an industry, but certainly we do need to regulate both.
Have you explored the different ways or different philosophies around how to regulate it, whether doing something like Victoria is the right move, where you say there's an X limit of total mothers, X limit of litters, because there's obviously a demand for it. And that's the real problem. If there wasn't a demand for it, there wouldn't be this wouldn't be an issue. If people knew, my heart tells me that if people knew where they came from, they wouldn't want to support that, because no one wants to buy a dog or purchase essentially this dog from this condition if they know it's going to be sick, if they know they got brought up for the wrong reason. Do you think taking that first step, is that the way that Victoria has gone, or is there another way that you think would be the better route?
Look, we've copied our legislation very similarly off the Victorian legislation, mostly because we know it works and we know that they did the research before they put their legislation up. We have made some changes to it where we felt that there needed to be improvements based, again, off the Victorian experience. And so, one thing that we found was happening in Victoria is a lot of these breeders were giving away puppies and having a contract where that puppy was still technically and legally theirs. And so the dog would be living in a family home, but would be brought back for breeding. And there was so many issues with these kind of contracts. We had horror stories. We heard from a woman who the vet said, this dog can't be bred from anymore. She probably won't survive another litter. And so she told the breeder, the dog won't survive another litter. The breeder says, too bad, she's my dog. I will make that call, not you. Now, you can imagine if you've got this animal in your family home, that animal is now a member of your family, and you're being told by this breeder, well, technically and legally, the animal is the property of the breeder. So we've learned from that. And so obviously we've created some restrictions and some situations where there are these contracts that people can get out of those contracts. They can either pay the market value for the animal, or if the vet says that animal is no longer suitable for breeding, then they can't be continued to be bred from. So, there are some things that we've learned from the Victorian one and been able to improve on, but essentially the structure is a limit of 10 females, a limit of 2 litters per female, and we've spoken with experts in New South Wales, staffing ratios, and then, of course, that whole source, the source number, so that anybody who sells an animal online can actually be traced down to exactly where that animal has come from, so that if there is suspected puppy farming, the enforcement agencies can actually oversee it. At the moment, there's no way of tracing where some animals have even come from.
That's crazy. There's so much work to be done in the space, but I think we really we started this and we hopped, skipped, jumped over a few things that I really just want to circle back onto. So we mentioned legislation a few times. We're talking about things that occur in terms of passing legislation, parliamentary standards, I suppose. And I really want to jump to what your role is in this whole process, and potentially even jumping through who AJP are, and kind of running through your position there.
So the Animal Justice Party is probably the first political party that's ever been focused entirely on animal protection. And we really came about because we could see that nobody was in Parliament representing animals. I mean, there was really a dead silence on a lot of these issues when it came to Parliament. And so that's where the Animal Justice Party came from. I'm the third elected member of the Animal Justice Party. And we've now got as well 3 councillors, as well as 3 MPs. So we're a growing party, and I think that really goes to show that, people are really putting their vote towards animals and making sure that animals have a voice in local government, state government, and obviously we're working towards trying to get somebody in federally as well. And so a lot of our animal protection laws are state-based, and so a lot of the work that we do, we could be introducing legislation in Parliament. Probably the easiest way we can get legislative changes is if the government puts up legislation that we can amend. So recently the government put up a piece of legislation which was about, it was just the Crimes Act, and it had something to do, I think, with child protection, which was, a good change that they were making. But we put up an amendment to that piece of legislation to outlaw the possession, production and distribution of bestiality videos and crush videos. And then we have to get the numbers in the upper house to pass an amendment. So we've only got 2 Animal Justice Party in New South Wales, so that gives me 2 votes. So we often, if we can't get the government on side, then we need to get the opposition. And then we need to also get the Greens. So the Greens are usually on side. The opposition are the next hardest ones to get. We also need independent Justin Field, who's quite progressive. He's always supported everything I put up. And then I need one more vote from the crossbench. So I can go to the Christian Democrats, I can go to One Nation, or if I fail in those two areas, I can go to the Shooters Party. That's usually when I'm kind of at the bottom of the barrel. But then, so I need one more vote to be able to pass an amendment. So something like the banning of bestiality material and crush videos. The Christian Democrats are really strong to support an amendment like that. And so we were able to very easily get that through. One Nation even supported it as well.
When I think of stuff like that, it's really strange to kind of think that anyone wouldn't support that.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been talking to the government for quite a while about it, and I think that some of the issues is just getting them to put it much higher on their agenda. And so it's not necessarily that the government was against it, but they didn't see a level of urgency to pass something like that. And so sometimes a lot of our work is also just getting issues within the media and creating that media pressure for the government to actually act on something.
That's awesome. So I'm really excited about 2022 and the few changes that you guys have planned there. You mentioned before, like is it as simple? I guess it's a very complex system, but if we really boil it down to the basics, is it really as simple as you had this legislation, which is like in the form of a white paper, I suppose, the different contents, and then you just go around getting signatures? Is that essentially how it works?
Not really. I guess there's really two ways that we can pass legislation, and I'll give two examples. And so one thing that I put up last year was a ban to convenience killing in pounds, which basically means the animals come in and they kill them because that's easier than trying to rehome them. And there was an incident of that in New South Wales recently, so we used that to get some media on it. Then we have to write the piece of legislation. Usually you're amending an act that already exists to change those laws. And there are people within Parliament that will help you actually write that legislation and make sure it's written the way that you want it to do and will have that kind of legal effect. Then you introduce it into Parliament with a long title. You do a second reading debate just yourself where you explain to people what the legislation will do and why it needs to be put forward. Then when you actually put the legislation up for a vote, you really need to go and talk to every one of those political parties and say, will you support this? Do you have any questions? Do you have any amendments? They can also amend what you're putting forward as well. And then when you take it down, you just have to hope that when you actually go to a vote, that the people who said that they would vote for your legislation will still be there, because you might be debating your legislation at 10 minutes to midnight. We're often there very late at night, and sometimes people go home or they feel sick. And so, your numbers might suddenly change. And also that obviously that they don't change their vote the last minute. Maybe somebody's gone and spoken to them and said, actually, can you vote against this? And so then you put that legislation forward. We put that forward, the convenience killing legislation. It passed in the upper house. I then go to a member in the lower house and ask them to introduce it there. So we often work with independent Alex Greenwich, who's the member for Sydney, and then he introduces the legislation in the lower house. Now, unfortunately, in the lower house, the government have the majority, which means that if they vote against it there, then the legislation won't go any further. But obviously passing it in the upper house will help you get media and attention on it. And it will also expose the government for failing to act on an important issue. The second way you can pass legislation, sorry, I'm being long-winded on this one.
Go for it.
The second way to pass legislation is really, like we did with tougher penalties. We went to the media. Every time there was a case where somebody was fined $200 for animal cruelty, we put out a media statement and we made sure we were constantly exposing the fact that New South Wales had the weakest penalties right across Australia, that the maximum fine for animal cruelty was $5,500. And that's why we were seeing these pathetic fines coming through the court systems. And so we kept bringing it up in the House. We bring it up in question times, in budget estimates, put the pressure on the minister. We had social media campaigns. We tagged the minister in our social posts. And just really bring it up constantly. And then we put in our own legislation. So we wrote our own legislation, then we got the numbers, then we told the government that we had the numbers. And so then the government put up their own legislation in an agreement that we wouldn't put our one up and actually take it to a vote. Now, their legislation wasn't as strong as ours, but then we can do the amendments, and then amendments are a lot easier to pass than legislation. So we're able to make it a bit stronger there, and then the legislation passed. So that's another sort of, it's a bit of an offshoot sort of pathway to do things, but it can work, especially if you've got the media on side.
Oh, for sure. A lot of it really sounds like, I guess, networking and knowing the right people, because if you start on the wrong foot with someone, you might never be able to have their hand in, say, a vote. Does it really come down to people kind of scratching their back, or are people quite, I guess, logical and take that emotional side out of it when it comes to legislation?
Look, I think it really depends on who it is you're dealing with. I think that certainly relationships do play a big part in it. But at the same time, sometimes, especially when it comes to the government, sometimes it's really about pushing them, to get them to act. They're not going to do something unless, you've really campaigned hard and pushed for something to actually change. That's something that I've noticed. And I think that, one thing that people often ask me, especially animal organisations, is, how do I convince this minister to do something? And usually my answer to them is, stop being so nice to that minister, because if you're being nice and friendly and sending friendly emails and asking them to do something and they're not acting on it, they're actually responding to all the people that are exposing them and actually pushing them to do something else. They're quite happy. If you're being nice, then that's not going to cost them their position. So I think that a lot of the time, what I recommend animal rights or animal organisations to do is to actually start pushing a little bit harder, especially when it comes to the ministers and the government, to encourage them to actually put these changes through.
Sometimes all you need is a bit of a push. It's, looking at the past conversations I've had with a lot of these people, and a lot of it as well, over the past few months, I've been chatting with Laura Rees from Agriculture Fairness Alliance, who actually did drop your name during our conversation, saying you do incredible work. So when we're looking at lobbyists in this kind of world, and it's really complicated because as much as we try, there's really no simple reductionist way to put how a lobbyist would work. In the space of, obviously, even just puppy farming, obviously we know when it comes to the meat and dairy industry, there are lobbyists and they do have certain pushes and pulls with varying degree and amounts. Have you come across pushback through any of the things that you've talked about from a lobbyist or a lobbyist-backed party?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the lobbyists are in the hallways of Parliament every time an animal issue comes up. And probably a really good example is the battery hen issue. So I chaired an inquiry into the use of battery cages in the egg industry, actually in my first year in Parliament. And the lobby groups went around, and what they actually told other politicians that were what these politicians told me that they were told by the lobby groups, was that they said, oh, we're actually not using battery cages anymore, we use conventional cages. Now, of course, a conventional cage is a battery cage. They just rebranded it to conventional cages because obviously battery cage had a bad vibe to it. And so then I had to explain, well, a conventional cage is a battery cage. Then the lobby groups went a step further and told them, don't worry, we're moving to furnished cages like a lot of these places in the EU, and we're getting rid of conventional cages. And so I asked them what their definition of a furnished cage was. And they said they gave the exact measurements, which was the same measurements as a battery cage. So, there's just this confusion. And a lot of these lobby groups, they're very wealthy, they're very influential. And of course, we have an agriculture minister in charge of the animal protection portfolio. So the agriculture minister, who is tasked with the role of promoting the animal agribusiness industry, is also tasked with animal protection, which is often in complete opposite of what these industries want to do. When you're talking about things like battery cages, or you're talking about even providing pain relief to an animal that you're going to, do some huge mutilation to, because they don't want to pay 15 cents or whatever it costs per animal to provide pain relief. So we've just got this minister with a massive conflict of interest, and he's under the thumb of these lobby groups. And if he's under the thumb of the lobby groups, then it's almost impossible to get changes in these spaces, which makes it very, very difficult. And it just goes to show how powerful these lobby groups are. And one thing that really shocked me when I first got elected was that, particularly when I was in this battery hen inquiry, is that the lobby groups, there was a couple of them. We're knocking on everyone's door, meeting with everyone, but there was silence when it came to the animals. There wasn't a lobby group in New South Wales Parliament actually going in and advocating on behalf of the animals. And quite often when I speak to people, they say, well, that's why you're there. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not a lobby group. And the lobbyists for these industries, they aren't a political party, you know what I mean? And so I can't then be the lobbyist as well as the politician. And I'm the only voice. And when there's no lobbyists, it almost gives this impression inside Parliament that, that the issue that I'm pushing for doesn't have, that real groundswell of public support, even though it does.
It's so fascinating how you're kind of almost being required to wear these two hats of being a politician and lobbyist. And even if I were to, in my head, construct a perfect world where there was a lobbyist based on animal rights, like obviously when it comes to the other side, when it comes to the actual product, the meat and the animal flesh, that's the product. And this product represents a certain amount of profit and they want to protect this profit. But when we're looking at actually opposing that, there's no real product to it. And so it comes to this mentality of, instead of the, I guess, more conventional way now is looking at land and seeing the opportunity the land can convert as profit, instead of doing that, seeing that land as an opportunity to rewild and to, like, we know the environmental degradation that goes through with these certain things. So the only possible lobby group that I can actually muster in my mind is one that, I guess, puts forth the value of the land. Like, is there even a potential for a lobby group that is the opposite of these other ones?
I mean, I think that there's probably potential for two. I think there is potential lobby groups for ethics, as long as they've got a real public groundswell behind them where they can kind of expose any kind of political party for not acting in a particular way on behalf of animals. And you can sort of see organisations like Oscar's Law doing that with puppy farming. And so, and I know that Oscar's Law one year went to all the election polling booths, and instead of saying vote for these people, they just said, put this party last because they won't ban puppy farming. And so, they're taking a particular issue, they've got hundreds of volunteers, and then they can go out and potentially affect politicians by voting powers. So that's one way that I think a lot of ethical lobbyists can go about it. And then as far as kind of with your example, which is a bit more sort of, how do we sort of look at it from a profit-driven sort of space, I think that there's a really big growing movement around sort of things like plant-based proteins and cell-based meats. And I think that there can be lobbying around that, rather than actually being, trying to be against a particular industry, it's about growing the alternative. So getting more and more money and funding and subsidies for things like cellular-based agriculture, creates that alternative market. And then, of course, consumers sort of naturally switch as well when we can get something that is probably going to be cheaper and healthier in the long run, and obviously without all the ethical and environmental issues as well.
There's so many great ideas there. And I almost think as we're having this conversation, obviously this whole system runs on a capitalistic viewpoint, and say what you will about capitalism, it's what we have. I wonder if the point of lobbyists, be it plant-based protein or not, their kind of role is to offer different viewpoints, but sometimes they obviously take this too far with, I'm assuming the way it actually works is very black and white, in which they literally fund a politician or that party, and then that can give that particular politician a raise, or, I'm thinking it's that kind of black and white. Does that kind of almost threaten a democratic leadership and a democratic system?
I mean, I don't know if any of these organisations are actually funding a politician. It's really interesting actually when you start to actually look at where the money has gone into, and I'm actually a psychologist by trade as well, and so when I look at where the money's come from, a lot of these lobby groups, like there was a lunch with one of the shadow ministers with the New South Wales Farmers Federation. And I think the lunch was something like $2,000 or something extreme. And they had like an $800 bottle of wine, because when you get this money, you have to actually declare it. And so that was declared as part of that politicians, what they've received. But it's really about that relationship building, right? So, rather than giving them $2,000 directly towards their campaign, and I think that does happen too sometimes, it's also about, let's go and I want to take you out for lunch. And they go to a very fancy restaurant and they buy the best wine. And so they're wining and dining these people in many ways as well, because you will, and it's something I've seen so often, is they're building these relationships with a lot of these change makers and people who can make big decisions on behalf of their industry. And then, of course, when you go and lobby that person, they see that person almost as a friend. And so when you go to actually visit them, and so I think there's a lot of psychology in this as well, and where that money is being spent. So it's more than just, I will fund this politician and then they will represent me. I think it's so much more complex than that.
It sounds a bit like high school, where someone's trying to manipulate other people for their own gain. But then some people, and a part of me wants to say this, and I do believe it, some people are actually in there with good intentions. And some I'm sure aren't. And you can't, the hard part, I guess, is diffusing who is and who isn't. But my question to you is, almost, have you been wined and dined, or offered to be wined and dined?
No, I don't. We don't get all those sorts of perks, I don't think, at the Animal Justice Party. I think that it's really interesting because I think it's really obvious where we stand on things. And so the people that agree with me know that they don't need to wine and dine me, and the people that don't agree with me know that I'm never going to change my mind. So maybe that's why I'm not getting the expensive wines and the fancy dinners. But it's interesting because you've got these two major parties. We've got the Liberal Party and then we've got the Labor Party. But when you look at the crossbench, that's where where people stand. So where the Greens stand on things. Where even the shooters stand on something. You can get a pretty black and white idea, or you can go and talk to these people and understand where they're coming from with things. But it's the Liberal Party and the Labor Party and the National Party which will kind of change their policies here and there, or, slightly alter the way that they're going to approach something. So it's often the crossbench that I think that is a lot more solid as a party on where they stand on most of these issues.
Yeah, definitely. And the crossbench is really important, especially coming into the next federal election and so forth. I think the crossbench is going to be really good for especially swing votes and things like that. On the kind of mode, and since we're coming into this election, something's been on my mind over the past maybe 2 years. I've been seeing how social media and I guess the world of influencers and the viral content, how that actually influences what party we vote, because that's a really important thing of how any country runs, Australia or otherwise. And we've got people like, say, Friendly Geordies and the Juice Media and of the likes really influencing or almost shedding light on different things. Do you think that's a good thing? And do you think there's room for more, or maybe we should dial it down a little bit?
Look, I think it's a good thing. I think that a lot of people are being able to use, and I think there's definitely pros and cons to social media. There's obviously online bullying and all these other problems with social media, but purely from a political platform, it actually often takes politics out of the hands of politicians from being entirely able to control the narrative. And I think that that's really important. I think that when the narrative comes from the people will hear or find out things that are happening in politics that they maybe wouldn't have otherwise heard of or seen. And I know, like, a lot of these videos, that you're talking about, you start to see things in a different light when somebody's really investigated the way that politicians looked at something. And when you're in Parliament, and obviously Parliament's live streamed, it's one of the jokes that we often have in my office is nobody's watching this. everybody in Parliament thinks that everyone's watching everything that we're doing, and they're not. You go online and it says like 21 people watching live. Like, the people of New South Wales are not, tuning in saying what's happening in the Legislative Council today. Okay, it's live streamed. It's available for the public to see exactly what we're talking about, so you'll be held accountable. But people just aren't engaged in politics in that level, and I think that more and more people have pulled away from politics because they just see the whole thing as so dirty. I think people have been frustrated with political parties and with politicians time and time again. It's one scandal after another in the media, and people just don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. Whereas I find that people who are some of these social influencers have found a way to get people to start to actually think about politics again. Because when people are too disengaged from Parliament and what's actually happening within government, then it's really hard to get change, because these people do need to be held to account. When they're making decisions that will, destroy koala habitat and mean that, koalas will go extinct in the next 10 years. We need people to listen to that. And if they're already exhausted from politicians and from Parliament and government, then it makes it very, very difficult for us to convince people to change their vote or to recognise which parties are making these kinds of decisions. And so I think that these social media influencers play a massive role in being able to get that message out there in a new and engaging way.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really important and crucial spin to what you were kind of talking about, which is investigative journalism, which has changed a lot. And I know that, I think 20 years ago was a very big thing. And then as times have changed and as funding has changed, there wasn't, I think personally from our own research, there wasn't as much need or market demand for such a thing. And these guys have really kind of taken that in a new way. But I want to talk into how you got into politics for a second, because you said in the first year, obviously you learned a lot and you started in psychology. And when I'm looking at the world being in the space of environmentalism and nutrition and health, there's a big opportunity for change makers in the space of politics, because I don't think we really have a huge shortage of activists, whether that's on the street or online, and different people doing comics and TV shows. These creative people are really taking storm due to the new age, which is fantastic. But the real opportunity in my mind of future change, that's a really big change makers, is in politics. So I want to know your story and how you got into it, and how, I guess, your advice on how to kind of lean into that and see if that's even something someone would be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I never really considered myself, wanting to get into politics, especially at a young age. I studied psychology actually, because I sort of had this moment where I found out exactly what was happening in a lot of these industries, and I knew I wanted to change it. But I didn't know what the best pathway would be to actually create that change. I worked for Animal Liberation New South Wales for about 10 years as a campaign director. And I also worked for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals as a media officer. I worked for World Animal Protection International, actually sort of assessing campaigns and being able to build in change. And, I really kind of honed a lot of my skills, while I was in those roles as well. I ended up doing, a big course around change making, so how to actually build progressive change. I was the only vegan or animal rights activist in that group. It was mostly human rights and environmental people that were part of that course. I also did a US tour where we met with a whole lot of change organisations in the US and learned what they were doing. I also wanted to work on my public speaking and media, and so I did some courses around that. And when somebody really approached me and said, would you consider running for the Animal Justice Party? I guess the question I asked myself is similar to what you were saying, is, where am I best placed to actually create change for animals? And I could see activists on the street with TVs, showing people, what actually happens inside slaughterhouses, and talking to people and really building on that individual behaviour change. And I could see organisations like Animals Australia just doing amazing work around corporate change and getting corporations to switch to more ethical values and to have ethical policies. And then you looked at the political space, and it was just so far behind. And the way I see change, the fastest way that we will get to change is to have individuals changing their purchasing behaviours and what they do on the weekend for entertainment and making sure that animals aren't involved in that. And then corporations making sure that they're not harming animals. But then the third stage is political. And in New South Wales, there'd been a ban on greyhound racing and then they backflipped. And, federally, they were pushing to increase the live animal export trade despite expose after expose showing absolutely horrific conditions for the animals on these ships and obviously at their destination as well. And, you could just see that there was so much work that needed to be done in that space. And, one example I often give to people in regards to why it's so important that there are voices for animals in politics is, we recently had an inquiry into the dairy industry, and the dairy industry was asking for more subsidies. More and more consumers are moving away from dairy and going to, the plant-based alternatives. And so that means that the profit lines are dropping for the dairy industry. So they're coming to the government and asking for more subsidies. They were asking for changes in labelling laws so that it has to be called soy juice instead of milk. They were calling on free milk to be put into children's schools to encourage, early adoption of consumption of cow's milk. And they're asking for money to prop up the industry because of the problems they were experiencing with the consumer shift. Now, what that means is that if you've made a decision to ethically avoid cow's milk or for health reasons or for environment reasons, your taxes are still being used to then prop up this industry so that they produce the same amount of milk and the same number of animals are used in this industry. And, that's hugely problematic. And, obviously I was on this inquiry and so I was able to push, a different narrative. But of course, the major parties are still wanting to back the industry, but without having somebody actually in Parliament pushing the other narrative and questioning why we would put more subsidies towards this industry, there's just silence and it's just accepted. So, that's one of the reasons why I ran for Parliament, because, we can change individual behaviour change, and we can change corporations and have more plant-based alternatives. But the government can still slow that process down quite significantly. And that's another reason why we need change in all of those three spaces.
How would someone even, I know you can only speak in terms of like an Australian context, I would assume, but how would someone even get involved in the political process to find out if this is something that they want to pursue?
Look, I do know that there are sister parties all around the world. So definitely look for some of those sister parties, but also go and meet your local representatives. I think that that's a really big thing. I think that it's really important to know who your local councillors are. It's really important to know who's your state representative and to actually go and talk to them about animal issues, no matter what party that they're from. And obviously, if they block you out, if they won't talk to you, then build a relationship with your local media and expose that person for not acting on animal issues. Start petitions about issues that are targeted at a person. Do protest outside their office, and make sure that the local media knows every time that they're ignoring an animal issue. It's almost like dipping your toe into the water to sort of work alongside the people that are already elected. And I think that gives people a bit of a taste as well, particularly if there's no representative specifically for animals in their area. But we've just had somebody elected as well to council. So I think that that's a really good place for people to start as well. So we just had somebody elected in Campbelltown Council, which is really important because, there's a massive koala population there in Campbelltown as well. And that's not like a full-time job. And so that's another space that you can make huge changes for animals on that local government level as well. So, I think it's about getting involved. It's about talking with people, finding those animal-friendly people, because they come from all different political parties as well, and actually trying to work alongside that person and volunteering to help with making sure that they put up a motion around animal protection, for example. And I think that will give people a bit of a taste for, what needs to happen behind the scenes to actually get these big changes.
I love all that. And getting in the political process is something we need more ethically and morally driven people to get into. You mentioned before about the dairy industry and how they were propping up certain subsidies, which of course they need more of. Um, so one thing that cracks me about taxes, like I'll take my free healthcare and my great education system, but Jesus, do they really have to fund that? Really? Um, you've got this, then you go out and you take a stance and you're like, hey, you're offering this different perspective. Usually on the show, we talk about how when having conversations, you obviously have to find out what the other person values. But I generally personally stick to the environmental side of things because for me, it's very black and white. It either is or it isn't good. And now when you're looking at AJP, and I had read all the different policy and things like that, but when you're talking in a political sense and you're looking at maybe taking a route that's more philosophy driven and ethically driven, are you going down that route, or are you going something more nutrition and environmental that's less so black and white?
It's really interesting because, I suppose we do talk, we talk about all three, but it's really interesting, in Parliament because it's almost as though because animal protection hasn't really been considered in Parliament for such a long time, it's almost not a left or right issue. And so people treat it quite differently when you bring it up in Parliament, whereas environment is considered left. And so if you identify as right, then, you don't want to hear the environmental argument. And so it's almost as though people have their very specific viewpoints already for issues around environment, whereas you might get somebody that's hard right conservative suddenly agreeing with you that we shouldn't be allowing convenience killing in pounds, or that we need to dramatically increase the penalties for animal cruelty. So it's because it doesn't have that history in Parliament. I think it's almost more flexible in its own approach when you're actually bringing some of these issues to Parliament, because as soon as you talk about the environment, people go, oh, this is where I sit on that issue. And they've already got their preconceived ideas on where their party will sit on that particular issue. Whereas most of these parties don't have any policies around animal protection. And so it comes down to, sitting down and actually sort of trying to talk them through what might happen to these animals. And then they will often, particularly on the crossbench, they'll make an ethical decision. They'll make an ethical call on where they think that they personally stand on these issues. Or they can be influenced, again, by those lobby groups. But again, then that's the lobby group saying it's not an ethical issue because X, Y, Z, or it will become a different ethical issue. So it's interesting. And I do find that sometimes there's more flexibility around talking about animal protection, even though as the Animal Justice Party, obviously we talk about all three, particularly the environment and animal protection, but health comes into it sometimes as well.
That's so fascinating. And I'd never thought of it like that, because it is something that's so, I mean, if you're looking at the environmental standpoint, you've got very powerful lobbies that don't want certain things said, and likewise with the nutrition thing. But with the ethical standpoint, especially when you look at, say, pets, yes, there's that lobby like you mentioned before, but in my research, and you might have some anecdotal experiences, they're nowhere near as powerful or as influential. And people can easily make that ethical decision, one, because the work's already done to have these companion animals, dogs and cats and the like. They're already in our hearts in such a unique way compared to, let's say, livestock. Have you noticed that there's a very big difference talking about the ethics between a cow and a dog, for example?
Absolutely. And I think that's, quite, it's really obvious when you're in Parliament, and sometimes it's almost with some political parties taboo to bring up some of these, huge issues that we have within the animal agribusiness industry. And that's really frustrating. But that's reflected in our laws as well. What is legal to happen to a farmed animal would be illegal if done to a cat or a dog. You can keep a battery hen in a cage for 18 months, which you can't move. You can cut off a large chunk of flesh off a sheep without even pain relief. Those acts would be illegal if they're done to cats and dogs. Our entire Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act legislation creates all these laws around what is cruel and what is illegal. And then it creates these massive exemptions for the animal agribusiness industry. So our laws are reflective of that already. And certainly, when you are talking with other politicians in Parliament, those conversations are very different as well. And I think, as you say, you've got these really powerful lobby groups for those industries. You don't have lobby groups that are as powerful in regards to companion animals and for example, no, everyone else. I was going to say wild animals, but I suppose the powerful lobby groups against wild animals are usually people who want to, bulldoze down all their trees or, do other awful things. And so, yeah, there is powerful lobby groups, I guess, against them too.
That's such a hard little thing to pass through. And for you guys, it's a really hard job to get used to that, because coming from, say, an average Joe, an average citizen, you wouldn't have to go through all of that, which is why maybe people aren't so much into politics. There is a lot of hoop jumping and you have to be on your toes, and it's a bit like you never left high school, that kind of thing. I'm curious to know, as an environmental fanatic, if you've been in any situations where, I guess, when you're looking at the environment, do you bring up things like the IPCC, or is there science that people say, or maybe they don't say any science at all? Do you see people hurdle off just complete BS, and you hear it and you're just like, that's so wrong? Like, is there an opportunity to say, hey, where's your source, or where do you get this information? Like, is there a chance to call people out when they're saying something that's just blatantly incorrect?
Yeah, look, there definitely is. Often we'll have quite heated debates in Parliament on particular issues. So what we can often do is bring up a notice of motion, and then you can take a lot of those notices of motion to debate in the House. And so when you get a time limit, but somebody could get up and make a debate about something, or they could be putting up an amendment. We've had quite a few bills recently, and people they get up and say things that are just absolutely nonsensical, and or they'll just make these broad sweeping claims. I know I put up an amendment to the plastics bill, so we were banning single-use plastics, and I put up an amendment to ban the release of balloons. So in New South Wales, you can still release balloons. And you hear people making these fantastic arguments as well. I remember somebody from Labor got up and their argument was really strong. And she said, you've got ads on the backs of buses, don't be a tosser. If I throw a piece of plastic on the ground, I can get fined. But if I throw a piece of plastic into the air that will end up on the ground or in the ocean sometime later, that's not littering, because you've actually created this exemption by making it legal to release balloons. And so it makes no sense. But then other people on the other side are saying, oh, you're just going to ruin children's parties. And it's,
yeah, it's really fascinating how they kind of really use emotion. They use these anecdotes, and they're like, you're stripping away. Like, the biggest thing that really comes to my mind, and when I heard ScoMo say it, I face palmed, and I didn't stop face palming for about 4 days. And he claimed that electric cars will end the weekend. And that's kind of gone really viral. And there's been a motion in Parliament saying, does the party believe that electric cars will end the weekend? Because it's like, what, you can't have power when it's clouds. And then I forgot who the senator was. And he's like, well, do they know that your shower still works when it's not raining? And that was the kind of philosophy, like, how will it end the weekend? And this is the things that they can really get away with saying and applying to, I guess, almost in a really sociopathic tendency to our fear. And they really tug on that. Oh no, I want birthday parties. I want the weekend. Why would anyone want to take the weekend or birthday parties away from me?
I find that sometimes, and I think it's quite often a clever tactic to simplify the argument and to try to turn it into something else. And sometimes we need to think strategically, do we respond to it? If the argument, like on the opposite side, is too complicated, or do we sort of have a different argument back? And because a lot of the time, a lot of their arguments have been developed by people who are, basically creating a tagline, because you say it enough times, and then that's what people will sometimes believe, because they haven't read the full article, they haven't read the research. And that's kind of sometimes what we're up against. The big thing that they kept saying when we were talking about battery caged eggs, they kept saying some people can't afford other cheap. This is the only cheap protein some people can afford. So, if you ban battery cages, it means that we're going to have a whole lot of people that are socioeconomically disadvantaged with protein deficiency. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. Chickpeas and peanut butter and all these other items, which are much higher in protein and much cheaper, so it's not a logical argument. But, and we almost had a bit of fun with that, because I actually got up and gave it was something about battery cages. And I said, and please don't put up the argument. And then they put the argument up because that's the argument that they'd been given. And other people got up and said, well, peanut butter costs this much, chickpeas cost this much. Who doesn't like a bit of hummus? This is how much protein these items have. And it's just, it becomes tagline 1 versus tagline 2. And it's been the same with puppy farming. The argument that's been put forward is, puppy farming is illegal because there's no legal definition of what a puppy farm is. So therefore, then the minister had an argument that, well, a puppy farm, therefore, could be somebody that is breaking laws that already exist against animal cruelty. And it's like, well, no, that's not what a puppy farm is, because you've still got none of these limits on the number of dogs that somebody can have. And so there's different ways of twisting the truth or trying to change the narrative by having some sort of short, sharp, simple sort of tagline, I suppose, for a lot of these campaigns, because we're bombarded by so many messages. And so, we've got to be really on top of what message they're giving, make sure we don't repeat their message, and make sure that our message sort of delivers the truth in a really simple way as well.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the big kind of what they're really good at is marketing. And that's, really sad. And that's where probably, I haven't looked at their budget, but I'm assuming some of it goes that way, or a majority anyway. And that's where I think the power of memes are really incremental for this next decade, because memes have gone more than just, hey, this Pepe or this, little cartoon figuration. It's actually a word and an emotion, and it conveys almost like your old newspaper comics in that little section that are they can be politically strong, and they can really push an agenda or something to the younger generation. And if done right, we can push I don't like the word agenda because it's generally framed as a negative connotation, but agenda just means what we think or believe is ethically, morally just for the future of the planet, our generations. I think that's a really cool free way to kind of push forward, because it seems like they're really good at making those taglines. And the only way to tackle that is, like you said, better taglines and better memes.
Yeah. And look, sometimes it's also about sort of exposing them, particularly if they're really, like the example you gave about the electric cars, if you've got the groundswell to be able to expose something, then great. But it's also about, knowing what their messaging is and fixing it. And putting the truth out there, and being better at putting the truth out there.
So amongst all this chaos, or organized chaos, as the parliament is in whatever country you reside in, it's generally going to be like that. We hear all this information, and there are a lot of good things that come out of it. And I'm sure there is a well-grouped amount of bad things and everything in between. How can we instigate change? And I know you can speak from the lens of an Australian citizen, but it would obviously apply to whoever listening in the different municipality or council or country in which you reside. But how can we effectively make change?
Look, I think it's really important for anybody who's in Parliament or whatever sort of government institution that the people are part of, whatever country that is, that they realise that people will vote based on these ethics. That's our strongest point. We've talked a lot about lobby groups, we've talked about money, we've talked about all these other things. But the other thing that they constantly look at is, will this win or lose me votes? And I think that one of the big things that I noticed when I first got elected was this general belief that a lot of politicians or a lot of elected representatives don't think that animal issues will win or lose them votes. And that's why they don't have any policies in those spaces. And that's why they're not acting in these spaces. But what we need to make sure is that they are acting in these spaces, and they do realise that people will potentially switch their vote on animal issues. We did some polling recently around puppy farming, and an enormous number of people who regularly vote for the Liberal Party said that they would potentially switch their vote away from the Liberal Party if they didn't outlaw puppy farming. Now, that's really strong, but that means that we also have to get the message out to those people, and we need to get the message out to whoever is in power, whoever is in government, that this is an election issue, that this is an issue that you can't continue to ignore because it will cost you votes. And so I think that that's another major area a lot of us can campaign on, particularly if you're already volunteering and doing things in the animal protection space, particularly when you're coming through an election period. Contact the people that are putting their hands up, ask them where they stand on particular animal issues. They might ignore you, but, and I think that, and I really like the strategy that Oscar's Law, which is a campaign organisation that's against puppy farming, going out there and actually collecting up the volunteers and getting people to and educating people when they're going to vote about where these political parties sit on certain animal issues. I think that's a really big way we can all instigate change. And I think another big thing, and I've already sort of made this point, is just to learn and introduce yourself to the local representatives that are currently already elected and make sure that animals are on their agenda. And if they're not, then, campaign against them and try to sort of make sure that somebody else is elected that will represent animals. Because I think that there's a lot of silence. I think a lot of activists step away from that sort of political lobbying. They think it's either too hard, or they think it's dirty, or they think that they'll be ignored. And I think that it's really about just, dipping your toe in and becoming part of it, and just being that voice for animals. And I think that more of us need to do it because, as I say, there's so many people doing great stuff around individual behaviour change and corporate change. And we just need so many more voices in that political space, and people need to be more confident to be part of it.
For sure. I know it does seem really daunting at the beginning, and especially this is especially important coming into for Australians a federal election, and really kind of taking this as the opportunity. It may be your first time to really look at maybe individual people who are going up and smaller parties, and because we all kind of know or get a grasp of what Liberal and Labor stand for and how they work, because we've seen the country run on them for many, many years. And it's a good opportunity to kind of learn about that, reach out on social media and see what these people stand for. And maybe it makes you excited about the process of politics, and maybe it makes you feel like you're a little bit more in control of where you live, because, it's hopefully wherever you are, a democratic society. So that's really exciting. I think we touched on a lot today. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with before we finish up, Emma?
Just to encourage people again to get involved. And, it's a really big space where animals haven't had a voice for a very long time. I often feel like I'm at the bottom of a hill. But at the same time, I have worked in these other spaces. I have worked in individual change. I have worked in corporate change. And even though it's so daunting, I have found that being in that political space, I've been able to achieve more for animals in the last 3 years than I have in the 12 years that I was working in animal protection before that. So it's a massive space where we can create change. And so even though it is daunting, I do encourage people to take those first steps, because there is so much possibility in that space.
Yeah, and I really just wanted to finish up saying a thank you, firstly, of course, for coming on and sharing this incredible conversation. It's something that we don't really touch on too much, unfortunately, but I'm really glad I had you on. It was actually through a request that I reached out to you. A few people started messaging me saying they really wanted to hear from you. So I hope that appeases those people. But also I really wanted to thank you for, sometimes just having this conversation and seeing you on social media, I'd imagine it does feel like you're at the bottom of the hill and you're trying to push a huge way up, and you're coming along a lot of opposition. And when we're looking at what you're actually really fighting for, which is the abolition of puppy farming and different legislation against dairy, to make sure that, generally speaking, Australia as a whole has a more moral and ethical compass when it comes to the treatment of animals. And that, of course, will be equally reflected in the health and nutrition of individual Australian citizens, but also the environment in which we live, less deforestation, more pure air, and of course, everything as the beautiful biodynamic system that Australia is will flourish. So I really appreciate your work in the space. There is definitely not enough for you in there. So I really appreciate it. And I'm excited for 2022 and all the things that you guys can do.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Emma. Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I definitely did. Thank you once again to Emma for coming on and sharing your wise words of wisdom. There is so much we didn't get to and there's so much we covered, so I hope you guys got something out of it too. If you did, you can find Emma on socials. I'll leave all the links in the show notes. Let her know how the episode landed for you. I just wanted to give a special mention. There's a few of you that actually DM'd me asking to get Emma on the show. So if there is a guest that you would like to hear from, whether it's their words of wisdom or whatever part of the world they are from, if you think they play an important role in, I suppose, battling what we have created, which is maybe not the most sustainable system for the planet, if there is someone out there that you'd like to hear from, let me know. Slide into the DMs at plant.paradigm or flick us an email, contact through the website, whatever makes you feel safe and secure. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I'll see you on next week's episode. Stay happy, eat plants, peace.